Alright, so today I want to cover some of the ball python slang that we use for some of the ball python morph combinations. And you'll see a lot of people talking about their lemon blast or their super blast. And let me tell you, if you don't really know the genes and how we kind of name those combinations and those pairs of genes, you don't really know what we're talking about. In this episode, I'm going to try to cover most of the basic combinations like Firefly and 8-ball and crystal and all the different combinations, the zebra bee, a lot of the stuff that you probably have heard before, and if you're just starting in ball pythons you may not have heard, and a lot of times when you hear them you don't really know what the genes are in the mix. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to Morph Market and I'm going to show you some of these impressive combinations and then show you the individual genes and the individual snakes that make up some of those combinations. And the funny thing is a lot of times you can have two snakes that aren't really impressive, you put them together and you get a really impressive combination when you mix those two genes together, and we give those combinations special names in the ball python industry. I don't know what Bobby's doing. Bobby is just a single gene bamboo. No special names for Bobby, except he's getting a little crazy today on camera. So let's jump over to Morph Market and check out some of those combos. Alright, so I am over here on morphmarket.com, and this is where everybody sells their snakes. There's tens of thousands of ball pythons over here on Morph Market. It's a great place to learn about snakes, and you can get addicted and you can end up buying a lot of snakes over here on Morph Market. So I'm actually going to start with the 8-ball ball python. And the 8-ball is really interesting because it is a completely black snake. And you know, if you're playing a game of pool, the 8-ball is completely black. That is probably where they got the name 8-ball, because it looks completely black. Well, it's actually a black ball python. You can also say it's an 8-ball that way, but I'm thinking they got it from the game of pool, the 8-ball. And if you actually look at the 8-ball, it's made up of the cinnamon and the black pastel gene. And you can see 8 balls are selling for quite a bit. This one's sold for $399. plus 50 shipping, so you're talking $450 for an 8-ball. It is a pretty high-end snake. And if we look at the individual genes, cinnamon and black pastel, you can look over here. This is a black pastel, which I've never actually worked with black pastel. I know a lot of people have tried to do a lot of different things with the black pastel. And if you look at this one, the black pastel is pretty cheap. This one is sold for $35. And you look over here, this is a cinnamon. So the cinnamon essentially is just a really dark, normal looking ball python. And 50% of the babies come out dark. So it's a genetically dark looking normal. I remember when the first ones came out and they were wondering if this is really, genetically transferred. And sure enough, it was actually one of the first ball pythons in the ball python craze was the cinnamon. So that is the 8-ball, and you can see both of these snakes that make up the 8-ball. This one's only a $40 snake too, so you can actually buy some pretty low-end snakes, put them together, and come out with the 8-ball. This one is pretty interesting as well. This is the Purple Passion, really beautiful snake. And if you've ever seen an adult Purple Passion, they really keep this really intense purple kind of a color with a bold stripe right down the back. Purple Passions are really awesome. This one is actually, to make a Purple Passion, you cross a Phantom with Mojave. And the interesting thing about Phantom is it looks pretty close to a normal. So the Mojave over here, if you've ever seen a Mojave, it's pretty typical. This is a really recognizable morph. It's close to the lesser, I would say. The lesser and the Mojave are both in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. And here is the Phantom. And if you handed me a Phantom, I would say that looks pretty much like a normal ball python. It is that close to a normal. But you mix those two together and you get the Purple Passion, which is pretty cool. Here is a Lemon Blast, and if you've been around ball pythons for a while, you know what the Lemon Blast is. Lemon Blasts are very common. They're composed of a Pinstripe and a pastel. It's a 2-gene animal. And you can see the pastel is just a really yellow ball python with, usually it's a broken up pattern in the pastel. And then the Pinstripe is pretty much a gold snake with a stripe down the back. That is the Pinstripe. And this one is very close to that one. This is actually the Killer Blast, close to the Lemon Blast. The Killer Blast is actually the Super Pastel Pinstripe. So it's actually also called the Super Blast, but a lot of times what they'll do is, you know, for the Super, they also call it Killer. So Super and Killer are kind of both names for Super Pastel. So anytime you hear like Killer Blast or Killer anything else, it usually has the Super Pastel in it, thus the name Killer, which is kind of interesting that they chose that name. So this is Super Pastel and Pinstripe. And we already saw the Pinstripe, but if you look at the Super Pastel, it's kind of even more into, sometimes they're faded a little, sometimes they're really bright, but you can see the head on the Super Pastel is really faded, and it usually has kind of these white markings down the middle. And actually, if you breed this to another snake, 100% of the hatchlings come out as pastel, which is pretty cool. So let's look over at the Queen Bee. And the Queen Bee is a pretty impressive combination. And the other thing you have to think about the bee, every time someone says bee, we're talking about spider. So if it's a Queen Bee, it is something with the spider. If we say bee, it's spider. So the Queen Bee is actually, you can't really say queen by itself. We just call it a Queen Bee, which is kind of interesting. But there are a lot of other bees that contain the spider gene. This one happens to be a pastel lesser spider. So the pastel and lesser make up the queen. And this is an example of a lesser. It's similar to the Mojave and the blue-eyed leucistic complex. And this is the spider. If you've probably seen the spider before, it's a pretty common snake. It has like a spider web pattern down the middle, and then it has almost like a calico coming up the side, but they don't actually have calico in them. As a matter of fact, if you put calico in a spider, you'd be hard pressed to actually see the calico in the spider. As a matter of fact, they call it, I think it's the calider bee or something like that, the calico spider, which is pretty interesting. Here is, let's take a look at the pewter. So if you've probably seen this before, the pewter is actually cinnamon and pastel mixed together. So the cinnamon and the pastel together make up the pewter. So this is actually the cinnamon. You can see it's very close to the cinnamon, but it actually has pastel on top of it. And a lot of times you'll hear pewter something else, and like a pewter bee would be a pastel cinnamon spider because you have the spider in there. And you kind of get used to, you know, if you see pewter, you know it's cinnamon and pastel. And sometimes you'll mix up like a queen pewter bee or something like that. It's interesting how you just kind of build the names together, and you figure out the slang, and then you can put together different combinations with the slang. It's kind of interesting. So take a look at this. This is a pretty interesting combination. Very common, I would say. It's called the Firefly. And essentially what the Firefly is, it is the pastel and the fire. And these are really, the pastel really gives it a lot of yellow, and the fire is really an enhancing gene. So it makes it, if you've ever seen a Firefly in person, it's like a pastel on steroids. It is a super bright pastel. And let me show you what a fire looks like. The fire has a little bit of yellow in it. I've actually produced some fires, but they're essentially what it is. You mix the fire with another gene, and it really lightens and enhances all of the other genes. They consider it really an enhancing gene. So over here, we actually have a Superfly versus the Firefly. So remember, if you have a Superfly, it's also called a Killer Fly. So the Superfly and the Killer would actually be, it's mostly, I would say, more commonly known as the Superfly, which is the Super Pastel and the Fire. So the Super Pastel we've seen, and we looked at the Fire. So the Bumblebee is kind of interesting. It looks like a bumblebee, really. It is really the spider and the pastel mixed together makes up the Bumblebee. which is a pretty interesting combo. Here is a Pastavi. If you've ever heard of Pastavi, it's actually, you can kind of figure it out. It's pastel and Mojave in the same name, Mojave Pastel. Let's take a look at this one. So this is kind of adding our new name to an old name, the Pasavi Bees. So you know what that is. That is the pastel Mojave spider. Every time you see the bee, it is a spider. And you're probably catching on by now. You've seen, you know, some of these repeated in some of the combinations. This one is a butterfly. And this one I would say is a little bit tricky, because if you don't know what a butter is essentially a different line of lesser. So it's essentially two people discovered the same gene. One named it butter, one named it lesser, and they found out it's essentially the same thing. It's just from two different people coming from two different lines. So this is actually, if we take a look at it, the fly, remember the fly was actually coming from the fire and the pastel, which is kind of interesting. So this is actually a butter pastel fire. Here's another one that's kind of interesting. This is the nuclear, and everyone says this is my nuclear ball or nuclear this and nuclear that. And I'm like, what in the world is that? It took me a while to figure out what a nuclear was. This is actually a butter with the fire. It's kind of the same thing as a lesser fire. It's the nuclear. This is kind of an interesting combination. This is the mimosa, and I'd say just from the name mimosa, there's no way that you're going to figure out what is in there just by the name. So the mimosa, it took me a while to figure this one out when I first started too. This is actually a champagne with the recessive ghost on top of the champagne. So the champagne kind of looks like a kind of a gold, kind of a muddied out snake, and then the ghost really lightens and enhances it. The ghost kind of fades everything out. So if you put ghost with something, it really lightens it. So I actually gave you, I pulled up a couple pictures of just, this is the straight champagne. This is kind of interesting. I'd say there's not a whole lot of people working with the champagne. It tends to have a head wobble in some lines, and some lines actually don't have a head wobble. And I've known some people breeding champagnes for a long time with no problems at all. But I would say you really have to pick the right genes for champagne to really make it pop. And this is actually the ghost. So the champagne ghosts is actually the combo we're talking about. This is well, so this is actually a ghost by itself, which we also call a hypo. So hypo is another name for ghost, which is kind of another slang. So if you have like a banana ghost, they can also call it like a banana hypo, like a hypo banana. It would be a banana ghost, which is, it's a little bit confusing because they pretty much interchange ghost and hypo. Even though hypo is just one gene, it's really not a combination. So this is the emperor, and a lot of people are talking about their emperors. Some people actually call this an emperor pin, which is the lesser pastel pinstripe, which is this particular snake right here. Here's another one. This one's pretty interesting too. This is the gargoyle. So the gargoyle is actually it's kind of interesting because it uses it's got het red exanthic in the mix on top of cinnamon. So the funny thing about het red exanthic is if you just look at a plain het red exanthic, it almost looks like it's het for red exanthic, but it gets a little bit confusing. So take a look at this. This is actually a het red exanthic, which looks completely normal. It doesn't really look like it's that impressive of a snake. And then we also have a red exanthic. So the interesting thing is the het red exanthic looks like a het by itself, but you start mixing it in with other stuff like cinnamon, and this is the het red exanthic on top of the cinnamon. So a lot of people will say, well, the het red exanthic really isn't a het because it's obviously doing some major changes to the cinnamon And it's really confusing, because if you look at het red by itself, it actually looks like a het unless you start mixing it with other genes. And then you can see the influence of the het, which is really strong. So some people argue, say, hey, the het red xanthic's not really a het, because I can clearly see it in some of these combos, which is kind of interesting. So this one, I don't know if you've ever heard of this one. This is not really popular. This is the Invisible, and on a white background, this one is almost invisible. So the Invisible is actually a blue-eyed leucistic. It is the Russo and the Mystic. And the interesting thing about the Russo and the Mystic is they're both really close to normal-looking snakes. I actually pulled up the Russo, and this is the Russo. And actually, when the Russo first came out, they actually called it het blue-eyed leucistic, or het leucistic, or het BEL. This is like the first one that actually came out where we knew this was actually going to produce the all-white snake with blue eyes, which is kind of interesting. And then this one, the Mystic, is another ball python in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. So you cross both those together and you get the Invisible. This one is a really impressive snake. As a matter of fact, when I first got into ball pythons, I was like, I need that snake. I want a crystal. That is such a beautiful snake. And the funny thing is about a crystal is if you actually breed it, essentially what you're getting is you're getting a Mojave and a special. So we saw the Mojave similar to lesser, but if you look at the special, there's nothing really special about the special, which is really interesting. It looks really close to a normal, but you cross it with the Mojave and you get the crystal, which is pretty impressive combo. This one you may have heard of before. This is the Jigsaw, and the Jigsaw is a pretty impressive snake, and it is composed of a Mojave and a Pinstripe. We saw both the Mojave and the Pinstripe. You cross them together and you get something like this, and it almost looks like someone took a jigsaw and cut a little line right down the back of the snake. That's why they call it Jigsaw, because it looks like it has a little jigsaw cut down the middle, a really bad cut from a jigsaw, which is kind of interesting. So this one's interesting. You probably haven't heard of the tiger, and the reason is you'd be hard-pressed to ever find a tiger. And I can almost guarantee if you go to any of the reptile shows, I can almost guarantee that you will not find a tiger. And the reason is because it consists of the desert and the enchi. So this is actually the problematic desert, and they found out the desert almost acts like the desert ghost, where it really makes the combinations pop. But the problem is with the desert gene is it's a co-dominant, and if you breed it to your snakes, you get a bunch of impressive looking hatchlings, but all the females containing the desert gene actually have problems laying eggs. They either lay clutches of slugs, or the females will actually die when they're laying eggs, which is a huge problem with the desert gene. And it got to the point where most of these people that are selling the desert, there's actually no description on this one, which I'm kind of surprised. Most people with the desert gene say this is pet quality only, because if you breed it, the females should definitely never be bred. As a matter of fact, on this male, you can actually breed this male, no problem at all. You get a bunch of really impressive deserts, but then you have to label all your females as pet quality only. You can never breed the females. And the thing I really like about the tiger is I've actually seen one of the best combos with the tiger, and that is this one. This is the tiger spider. Really impressive combination. It looks almost like a super enchi something or other. This is a crazy looking snake, and this is essentially a spider on top of the tiger, which is the desert and enchi. So I thought I'd pull up desert. This is what the base desert looks like. This is a co-dominant. You breed it to something, half the snakes come out desert. It's It's unfortunate that the desert actually kind of conked out, and it had a problem with the females. I remember when it first came out, I saw some videos on YouTube, and they're like, "This is the best thing ever. I'm gonna breed it through all my snakes. I'm so excited." And little did they know that the whole project just kind of flopped, and it's pretty much nobody really breeds deserts that much anymore. It looks like this one actually came from. One of them actually came from, well, this one is from NorCal Balls, but I noticed on this one over here, this was actually BHB, and it's actually from 2014, 2015. So I'm not sure if BHB is still breeding these, but I would say there's not a lot of people that are still into the desert. So this is an Enchi. We were talking about the Enchi and this other one. So Enchi essentially just reduces the pattern. I really love Enchi. Everything goes good with Enchi because it really reduces and changes up the pattern, and it's really powerful. There's actually different lines of Enchi. Some are really reducing, and some are just reducing just a little bit, which is kind of interesting. So this is a zebra bee. If you've never seen a zebra bee, the zebra bee is actually just an axanthic with the spider. Remember, the bee is for spider, and zebra is essentially the axanthic with the pastel. So the pastel, essentially what that does is it really cleans up the axanthic, and it makes really sharp lines, and it really cleans it up. And then you add the spider on top of it, sharpens it even more, and then they call it the zebra bee, which is pretty impressive. And the only one I haven't really showed you, I showed you the spider and the pastel. I thought I'd throw in just an axanthic at the end. So this is just the axanthic by themselves, and some of them look really silvery, and some of them don't have that much silver. I'd say this is probably not as silvery as I've seen some of them. It's interesting, the different lines. But I would say if you're trying to shoot for a zebra bee like this, you probably want the most silver line of axanthic that you can get to mix to come up with the zebra bee. All right, so there you have it. Those are some of the common names that we use in the ball python industry. As a matter of fact, if you forget what they are, you can always go over to Morph Market. You can do a search for the common name. For example, if you did a search for mimosa, it would actually break it up into champagne and ghost, and you could actually figure out what the genes are that way. So if someone says, "Hey, I got this Superfly," you can actually go in, type in Superfly, and it'll actually break it up, and you can figure out what the individual genes are in that snake over on Morph Market. So that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.